I found out my father died from a Facebook post. Not a phone call. Not a text. A photo of a floral arrangement my mother posted, with the caption "Rest in peace, to the best man I ever knew," and a date for the funeral, 3 days later. A funeral I was never invited to. My name is Megan. I was 31 years old, and for 3 days I sat with the fact that my own family had decided I wasn't worth a phone call when my father died. But 2 weeks after they buried him without me, a lawyer called asking why I hadn't come in to hear the reading of the will. And that phone call was about to blow apart everything my family thought they understood about my father, about his money, and about exactly who he trusted before he died. If you've ever been erased by your own family, stay with me. Because what happened next is the reason I believe some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how hard people try. To understand why my family didn't invite me to my father's funeral, you need to understand the version of me they'd decided to believe for the past 6 years. I grew up the middle child between my brother Tyler and my sister Paige, in a house where my father, Robert, ran a small but successful contracting business, and my mother, Diane, ran the household with a level of control that left very little room for anyone to have an opinion that didn't match hers. When I was 25, I made the decision to move 800 miles away for a job opportunity, and more honestly, to get some distance from a household dynamic that had become suffocating. My mother took that decision as a personal betrayal. In her retelling to relatives, neighbors, and eventually anyone who would listen, I hadn't simply moved for a career, I had abandoned the family. Turned my back on my father in his final years, and always thought I was too good for this family. None of that was true. I called my father every single Sunday for 6 years. Not my mother, my father, specifically, because he was always the one who picked up, always the one who wanted to talk, always the one who told me, quietly, near the end of almost every call, "Don't worry about your mother, she'll come around." She never did. And slowly, over 6 years, my mother's version of events, the abandoning daughter, the ungrateful one, the one who chose herself over family, became the accepted family narrative. My brother Tyler, who lived 20 minutes from my parents and saw them every week, absorbed that narrative completely. My sister Paige, always eager to stay on my mother's good side, reinforced it at every opportunity. I became, in my own family's collective memory, someone I simply wasn't. And I didn't fight it. Because I believed foolishly, I now understand that my father knew the truth, and that was enough. Then he got sick. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before he died. I know this now. I did not know it then. For 14 months, while my father fought a terminal illness, my mother made the decision, apparently supported by my brother and sister, that I did not need to be informed. Our Sunday calls continued exactly as they always had, my father telling me about the weather, about a contracting job he was consulting on, about a documentary he'd watched. Never once in 14 months did he mention that he was dying. I've had to make peace with the fact that I will never fully know why. Maybe my mother forbade him from telling me. Maybe he was protecting me, or protecting himself from having to have that conversation. Maybe some combination of both. What I do know, because I learned it much later, is that my mother explicitly told my brother and sister not to reach out to me about it, framing it as respecting Dad's wishes for privacy, though I've come to believe it was really about control, about deciding once again who got to know what, and when, and why. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March. My mother found out I knew about his death only because a cousin, someone outside my mother's direct sphere of influence, saw the Facebook post and texted me, assuming I already knew, asking how I was holding up. I called my mother immediately. She answered, and when I asked why no one had told me, she said, and I remember this word for word, "We didn't think you'd want to be bothered, since you've made your priorities clear." The funeral was in 3 days. She did not, in that phone call, invite me. I asked directly, "Am I invited to the funeral?" And she paused long enough that the silence answered before she did. Tyler and Paige and I have already planned everything. It's a small service, close family only. I was his daughter, and I was being told, explicitly, that I did not qualify as close family. I spent the day of my father's funeral in my apartment, 800 miles away, watching a live stream that a distant aunt had set up for relatives who couldn't travel. A live stream, I should note, that my mother had approved for out-of-town cousins, but apparently never considered I might want access to as well. I only found the link because that same cousin sent it to me without asking permission from anyone. I watched my mother deliver a eulogy about a marriage of 40 years. I watched my brother speak about a father who taught him everything about being a good man. I watched my sister cry, real tears, genuine grief, standing in a black dress in a church I used to attend as a child, surrounded by relatives who had apparently all been told some version of the story that explained my absence. Not one person mentioned my name. Not one person acknowledged there was a third child. My father had 3 children, and at his own funeral, the eulogies were written as if he'd only ever had 2. I sat alone in my living room and watched my own erasure happen in real time, narrated by a woman I called my mother. I didn't cry during the live stream. I want to be honest about that, because I think it surprises people. The grief hadn't caught up with me yet. I was too stunned, too disoriented by the sheer scale of what was happening, to access something as simple as sadness. That came later, alone, days afterward, in waves I couldn't always predict or control. What I felt during the funeral itself was something closer to disbelief. A slow, creeping realization that my family had made a decision about who I was, and were now performing that decision publicly, permanently, in front of everyone who had ever known my father. I closed the laptop before the service ended. I couldn't watch the burial. 2 weeks passed. I heard nothing from my mother, my brother, or my sister. Not a call, not a text, nothing acknowledging that my father had died, that I existed, that any of this had happened to me too, not just to them. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as Patricia Ellsworth, an estate attorney, and asked if I was Megan, daughter of Robert. I confirmed that I was, bracing myself for some kind of formality, some administrative footnote to a process I assumed had already happened without me. Instead, she asked why I hadn't come in for the reading of the will. I told her, as plainly as I could manage, that I hadn't been informed there was a reading, and that I hadn't been invited to my father's funeral either. So a will reading seemed like an unlikely event my family would think to include me in. There was a pause on the line. Then she said something that changed the entire trajectory of what I thought I understood about my father's death. "Megan, your father updated his will 11 months ago. You're not just a beneficiary, you're the executor. This entire process cannot legally move forward without you." I drove 800 miles the following week, back to the town I'd left 6 years earlier, into a law office where I would learn the truth my mother had spent 14 months trying to make sure I never found out. Patricia explained that my father had come to her alone, without my mother's knowledge. 11 months before his death, 3 months after his diagnosis. He told her, according to her notes, that he wanted to update his estate plan before it's too late to make things right. He named me sole executor of his estate. Not my mother. Not my brother. Me, the daughter my family had spent 6 years describing as absent, ungrateful, and disconnected from the family. He left the family home, which my mother had always assumed would pass to her outright, in a trust structure that guaranteed her the right to live there for the rest of her life, but placed ultimate ownership in my name, specifically so that, in his words as recorded by Patricia, the daughter who actually calls me every single week has some say in what happens to this house, instead of being shut out of it the way she's been shut out of everything else. He left a separate, smaller inheritance to my brother and sister, roughly proportional to what he left me directly, but the controlling authority over the estate, the actual decision-making power, belonged entirely to me. And then Patricia read me one more thing, a letter, handwritten, that my father had asked her to keep sealed until the day of the will reading, addressed not to the family, but specifically to me. In it, he wrote that he'd known for years the story being told about me wasn't true, that he'd heard every phone call I made, every Sunday without fail, for 6 years, and he wanted it on record, permanently, legally, undeniably, that he knew exactly who had stayed and who had told a different story about it. He wrote that he was sorry he never had the courage, while he was alive, to correct the narrative out loud to the rest of the family, but he wanted to make sure that after he was gone, there would be no ambiguity left about the truth. I sat in that office and read a letter from my dead father proving, in his own handwriting, that the family narrative I'd spent 6 years quietly absorbing, the ungrateful daughter, the one who abandoned him, had never been his belief at all. It had only ever been my mother's. Patricia scheduled the formal reading for the following week, and this time, as executor, I was the one who decided who would be present. I chose to invite my mother, my brother, and my sister, not out of generosity, but because the will legally required their presence, and because some part of me needed them to hear it directly from Patricia, in a room, in real time, rather than through some sanitized version I might later be accused of exaggerating. I watched my mother's face as Patricia read the terms. I watched the exact moment she understood that the house she believed was hers outright now legally depended on my authorization for any future sale or transfer. I watched my brother do the math on inheritance amounts, visibly recalculating his understanding of who our father actually trusted. My sister was the first to speak. This has to be a mistake. Dad wouldn't have done this without telling us. Patricia, calmly, professionally, informed her that my father had in fact been extremely deliberate and had visited her office alone, on multiple occasions, specifically to ensure the document reflected his exact wishes without any family interference. My mother's reaction was the one I'll remember most clearly. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She looked directly at me and said, "You turned him against us." And I understood in that moment, sitting across from the woman who didn't invite me to my own father's funeral, that she still, even now, even with a legal document in front of her disproving everything she'd told herself for 6 years, could not accept that my father had simply, independently, quietly known the truth the entire time. She needed a villain in this story, and she had decided once again that the villain would be me. I didn't argue with her. I didn't need to. My father had already said everything that needed saying, in his own handwriting, filed with an attorney, entered into legal record. I wasn't fighting for validation anymore. I already had it, sealed in an envelope, written by the one person whose opinion I'd actually been trying to protect for 6 years. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters more than the confrontation itself. I did not use my authority over that house to punish my mother. I could have. Legally, I had grounds to force decisions she wouldn't have liked. I chose not to. I authorized her continued residence exactly as my father had structured it. I didn't evict her, didn't sell the house out from under her, didn't use my new legal standing as a weapon the way my family had used exclusion as a weapon against me. Not because I felt she deserved my generosity, I'm honestly still working through how I feel about that, but because my father's letter wasn't asking me to get revenge. It was asking me to make sure the truth was finally on the record. That, and only that, felt like the responsibility I actually owed him. What I did do was quietly, formally, ensure that any future sale of the house, any transfer of ownership, any major decision about that property would require my signature, permanently, as long as she lived there. Not out of spite. Out of the simple, practical fact that my father trusted me with that responsibility, and I intended to honor it exactly as he wrote it, whether or not my mother ever apologized for the funeral, for the 14 months of silence, or for the 6 years of a story about me that was never true. My brother reached out a month later, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement, the closest thing to one I've received from anyone in my family. He said he hadn't known how much of what my mother told him wasn't accurate, and that he was sorry he hadn't asked more questions before believing it. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and after everything, something mattered. My sister and I don't speak. My mother and I speak rarely, and only about logistics related to the house. Always brief, always businesslike. I've made peace with the fact that this may be the permanent shape of my family going forward, smaller, more honest by necessity, but far less warm than it might have been if the truth had simply been allowed to exist while my father was still alive to defend it himself. It's been a year since that will reading. I visit my father's grave twice a year, on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death, always alone, always 800 miles from a house I now legally control, but rarely enter. I've thought a lot about why he chose to write that letter instead of simply confronting my mother directly while he was alive. I think, in the end, he understood something about her that I only fully understood after his death, that some people cannot be argued out of a story they've built their identity around, no matter how much evidence you put in front of them. He knew that trying to correct her narrative while he was alive would have cost him peace in his final year that he didn't have to spare. So instead, he left the truth somewhere she couldn't argue with. A legal document, a sealed letter, a structure that guaranteed I would finally, permanently, have a voice in a family story that had spent 6 years writing me out of it entirely. I wasn't at my father's funeral. I will carry that for the rest of my life, and there is no legal document, no inheritance, no vindication that changes the simple, permanent fact that I didn't get to say goodbye to him in the room where everyone else did. But I know, in a way I never fully knew while he was alive, that he saw me. That he heard every single Sunday phone call, that while my mother was telling an entire church full of relatives a story about a daughter who abandoned him, my father was sitting in an attorney's office making absolutely sure that story could never survive him. They didn't invite me to say goodbye, but my father made sure I got the last word anyway. If you've ever had your own family write a story about you that wasn't true, let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling a lot of you know exactly what that silence feels like. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because next week I'm telling you about the mother-in-law who thought she controlled everything in her son's marriage, until she found out whose name was actually on the deed to her own house.